Hello, I'm John, and welcome to Booked Capacity. It is less than 24 hours from the 1st of June at the time of me recording this, and all I can say is, wow, I can't believe it's June already. It seems like this year has really been flying by. I mean, we're already at the halfway mark, which is crazy to me. The beginning of the month is also a reminder to share my book recap of the month, in this case, the month of May. I thought May was not going to be the greatest reading month for me, and that was for two reasons. One, I was out of town for about half of the month, so it cut into my reading time just a little bit. And the other was the demands of life just seemed to really occupy my headspace for most of May, so I thought reading was going to be a little bit of a challenge this month. I was able to read and finish about six books this month. One of them that currently holds the crown of probably the greatest book I've read so far this year. Potentially, I'm talking about a book that is probably my top two favorite reads of all time. Without further ado, I can't wait to share, so let's go ahead and jump into the books of May. I had to start May with one of my favorite authors, Larry McMurtry, and his book Comanche Moon. A little background, Comanche Moon is one of four books in the Lonesome Dove series. It is technically the last book as far as when it was published. However, if you were to look at it chronologically through the characters and the story, it is technically book number two. If I had a comparison, I would say it's like Star Wars, where episode 4, 5, and 6 were created before episodes 1, 2, and 3. From the research I have done, most decide to read Lonesome Dove first. However, I decided to read the books in chronological order as opposed to starting with Lonesome Dove. If you watch my April book recap, I already read Dead Man's Walk, which is the first book in this series. I loved Dead Man's Walk, which led me to Comanche Moon. Like Dead Man's Walk, we follow our main characters Woodrow Call and Gus McCrae, two Texas Rangers who go on various expeditions across the Texas plains. Gus and Call are under the command of a man called Captain Skull. A Comanche war thief called Kicking Wolf steals the captain's horse. This leads to Skull recklessly going on foot, along with a Native American tracker named Famous Shoes, to go ahead and track Kicking Wolf to get his horse back. What I found funny in that scene is not only the fact that he chose to go on foot when the Rangers had plenty of horses to spare, but also the captain, just on a whim, makes Gus and Call captains before he leaves on this journey. He's just basically like, "Hey, you're the captains now," and just leaves. And Gus and Call are just as confused as the other Rangers. I don't know. I found that pretty funny. We also learn in the book about Gus and Call's personal lives when they're not on Ranger expeditions. Both are dealing with issues with the women in their lives. Gus is in love with a woman named Claire, but she is engaged to another man. Paul has an affair with a prostitute named Maggie, who ends up pregnant with his child. Instead of falling in love and raising the child as their own, Paul becomes kind of emotionally detached to Maggie, which leaves just lasting emotional scars on both characters. This book also follows major plot lines of other characters besides Gus and Call. For example, some plot lines follow a reoccurring character from Dead Man's Walk. I'm talking about the infamous Comanche war chief Buffalo Hump, and the conflict between him and his son Blue Duck takes centerfold in this book. Buffalo Hump terrorized the Rangers in Dead Man's Walk, and his presence still sends fear throughout the frontier, even though Buffalo Hump is now older in this book. Buffalo Hump's world around him is also fading. The buffalo are dying off, and the Comanche's influence is just fading in general along the frontier. You see the contrast between Buffalo Hump, who represents this kind of old order of the Comanche, this old order of the world, and his son, who is more unstable and recruits this band of renegade Native Americans that just cause death and chaos across the frontier. Another plotline revolves around a terrifying Mexican bandit named Armando, who lives in this barren, harsh setting where he and his gang have this infamous reputation for torture and brutality. I do not want to spoil too much, but someone does get captured by the gang, and the experience is just bone chillingly dark. The physical and psychological torture the hostage goes through is just some of the most disturbing, chilling things I've ever read in a book. Overall, this book has a lot of what you want in a good book, especially a Western. You have amazing descriptions of landscape, entertaining dialogue, action, heavy emotions, and reflective themes. If you've read Dead Man's Walk, it ends kind of on a positive note, but Comanche Moon ends on more of a somber note, in my opinion. You see the transformation of not just the frontier, but of Gus and Call that will eventually lead into my next book. Man, I don't even know where to begin with this book, but I'll try my best. In my February book review, I talked about East of Eden and how amazing of an experience it was reading it for the first time. I thought that was going to be the best book I will read this year. Well, I think that honor has been taken over by no other than the legendary Lonesome Dove. When you hear about Lonesome Dove on social media, it seems to get this universal praise and hype. Usually I'm a little cautious with books that get that type of hype and reputation. Not that I didn't believe the hype because I knew I was going to read it eventually, but I tried going into reading this book with a blank slate as possible. By the end of reading it, I felt like I had just like an out-of-body literary experience. One warning I will give about reading Lonesome Dove, especially if you have an edition like this, is do not read the foreword or the preface. I repeat, do not read the preface or the foreword in this book. This is because there are spoilers in the preface. I was able to stop in my tracks after reading the first spoiler, but I would hate for you, the readers, to have some of the key events spoiled by reading the preface first. So just keep that in mind if you read this edition. In Lonesome Dove, we follow our two familiar characters in the Lonesome Dove series, Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call. They are now middle-aged, retired Texas Rangers living in a fictional town along the Texas-Mexico border called Lonesome Dove. They own a ranching outfit called the Hat Creek Cattle Company. An old familiar face of Gus and Call arrives in Lonesome Dove and plants the seeds of an idea to embark on this big cattle drive from Texas to Montana, where the land is mostly unsettled and they try to establish a grand cattle ranch. That is the plot that drives the book as you follow not just Gus and Call, but a variety of other characters who have their own unique contributions to the story. You know that saying, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey? Well, all that happens in between that journey to Montana is just what makes this book just purely special. One of the key takeaways that makes this book special to me is just how character driven it is. These fictional characters feel so real, so genuine that you become emotionally attached to them. Gus and Call are opposites when it comes to their personalities and view on life. They butt heads, but they genuinely care for one another. Throughout the book, it switches perspectives too, so you learn a lot about the other characters. You learn about their hopes, their fears, a little bit about their background, and their interpretation of the key events that happen in the book. A good number of the main characters express heavy emotions, which leads them to tears. I found this very powerful because it goes against this made up concept that strong men do not cry. It highlights how showing vulnerability and empathy are honorable traits. Overall, the character dialogue and development is just A+. Lonesome Dove has everything you want in a good story. There's action, adventure, love stories, and witty philosophical dialogue. Throughout the story, you are laughing, holding your breath, in a state of shock or numbness over what you just read. You also notice the slow death of the frontier. McMurtry wrote this book as sort of an anti-Western where he shatters the mythical characteristics that define the West and the frontier and kind of paints the landscape and journey that these characters take as harsh, unforgiving, and unpredictable. You see signs the frontier is changing, and the characters not only notice it, but it begins to shape their entire experience. I will say this book is a brick. As you can see, it's almost 900 pages, but I really challenge you to not let the length of the book scare you off. Despite the length, it is super easy to read and flows to the point where you're not even thinking about the length. If I had one criticism of this book other than I wish that there was just more of it, I guess I would say that the first 200 pages or so is not what I would call action packed. It is more dialogue heavy early on, and it feels like you are just hanging out with these characters. Now, I personally do not mind because the character dialogue is one of the book's strongest traits. But when you think of westerns, it's easy to picture shootouts, constant action, and the lack of action early on might turn some people off initially. I think I heard someone on YouTube say Lonesome Dove has a 200-page wall you need to conquer before it gets good, but I respectfully disagree with that. Man, I feel like I'm missing many other details about this book. This was a hard review for me because there's just so much I wanted to say without trying to spoil the experience because I want you, the readers, to have your own unique reading experience when reading this book. The emotional journey that this book takes you on packs a punch to the point where I had to pause just to really take it all in. After reading a book, I usually pick up my next one on my shelf, but I really had to take a break before jumping into another book because just how powerful of a reading experience this was for me. I tend to read fast, but this is not a binge book. Take your time with this book and draw your own observations and feelings. I cannot say enough wonderful things about Lonesome Dove. Please read this and buckle up because you will not be the same person after reading this. 6 stars out of 5, one of my favorite books of all time. Check it out. You know those shelves and stand of books in a bookstore that are listed as bargain fiction or nonfiction? Well, I found this book there. In addition to the fair price, I was just drawn to the cover without really knowing what this book was all about. I mean, look how nice this cover is with the bull, the matador, just a stunning cover. I actually attempted to read this almost 2 years ago, and for some reason or the other, it just wasn't sticking. I don't remember the full reason, but I stopped reading it, but for some reason or the other, I told myself I was going to come back to this book another time. Fast forward to some years later, I thought, what the heck, let's give The Sun Also Rises another try. We follow this group of American and British expats living in Europe in the 1920s 20s after World War I. The main protagonist is a young journalist who goes by Jake Barnes, who's living in Paris. He has this complicated emotional relationship with this girl named Lady Brett Ashley. She is this outgoing, charismatic young woman who has some complications of her own. She has trouble committing to partners due to an abusive past relationship and really wants to fall in love with Jake. However, Jake can't provide this for her. Jake lost his manhood in the war, if you catch my drift, what that means. So basically, this makes it impossible for Jake and Lady Ashley to be emotionally together romantically. Jake and Lady Brett are part of what's called the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation is a generation of young men and women who come of age during the destruction and trauma caused by World War I. This causes our characters to have this sense of disillusionment with life and lack of purpose due to the atrocities that they witnessed during the World War. There are other characters in the book who are also part of the Lost Generation, and the novel revolves around their conversations in cafes, parties, and eventually a trip to Spain. Without spoiling too much, this book is less plot driven and focuses on these characters as they navigate their moods, numbness, and search for something better. Each character has a different perspective and side effect of what the Lost Generation dealt with. It is really a look at human nature in the face of delusion. One takeaway from this book is holy crap, they drink a lot. It seems like every couple of pages or so, one of the characters is either drunk or is consuming a lot of alcohol. Although the Lost Generation is a heavy topic, I found moments of absurdity and humor from the characters, which really just creates some really good dialogue and humor in the book. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, especially when they went to Spain. I know these characters have a lot of emotional baggage that they're dealing with, but there's just something romantic about just living in Europe and train hopping around the continent, drinking at cafes, seeing the sights, and interacting with the locals. It made me think a lot about the consequences of war. Although the guns have stopped firing and the fighting has stopped, we see deep scars inside those who have survived and the other people who have lived through it, where they will never really be the same again. Not my favorite Hemingway book, but overall I found it very solid and short enough that it's not super overwhelming and it's still enjoyable. Go ahead and check it out. I was actually watching an episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air where the main character Will Smith mentioned the autobiography of Malcolm X. It reminded me of the impact and publicity that book has received and still continues to receive. And also reminded me that I needed to read this book because I have not read it yet. Before I jump into this book, I have to admit that my knowledge of Malcolm X is pretty limited. When I was learning about the civil rights movement in school, we talked a lot about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But Malcolm X was not talked about as much. In college, we learned a little bit more about him, but it was more about his writing and less about his life, what led him to become a civil rights icon. I learned about this famous autobiography of him, and I thought of no better way to learn more about the man than to read this book. I really enjoyed this autobiography, and I can see why it's considered one of the greatest autobiographies of all time. What I found most fascinating was seeing the shift of Malcolm's ideology and thinking as a member of the Nation of Islam versus when he returned home from Mecca. For me, it shows the power and importance of changing your beliefs and thoughts when faced with new evidence, perspectives, or altering life events. I feel like, especially today, if you change positions on key issues, you're seen as like a flip flopper or a sellout. But Malcolm was not afraid to be vulnerable in changing his perspective, and I think that's one valuable lesson you take away from the book. I also really enjoyed how driven Malcolm was. Malcolm did not finish high school, and during his prison term, he was receiving letters, but he was unable to express his feelings back. As a result, Malcolm decided to write out the dictionary and read it back to himself to feel comfortable with his own writing and reading books day and night until he not only knew how to spell his words, but also understand them. He also practiced public speaking and debating. All this hard work helped propel him into one of the most impactful civil rights leaders of all time. My last comment about this book, without spoiling too much, is how Malcolm seemed to assume his life was going to end. In the last pages of the book, you get a sense that Malcolm is recognizing his own mortality and what consequences might follow as an African American leader during a tense time in America for race relations. It served as a clear reminder of what others had to go through and how some unfortunately lost their lives in the cause of equality. I know I probably left off a lot more details, and you may have other perspectives and reflections I may have missed when reading this book, but check it out for yourself. Great autobiography about a great and important figure in history. You won't be disappointed. So I was watching one of my favorite YouTube channels where he talked about a play Cormac McCarthy wrote. For those of you who don't know, Cormac McCarthy is one of my favorite authors, but I never associated him with playwriting. The YouTube channel gave a glowing recommendation, so I decided to give The Sunset Limited a try. The Sunset Limited is a one-act play with only two characters. First character goes by White, and the second character goes by Black. White attempts to jump in front of a moving train, and Black saves him and takes him back to his apartment. Black is a black man who is also an ex-con and not really well educated. He lives in a modest apartment where from time to time he tries to help out society's outcasts. White is a white man and a professor who is well off for the most part, but decides he wants to end his life. The whole book slash play takes place in Black's apartment, where he and White go into deep discussions about a variety of topics, like faith and the meaning of life. White has such a nihilistic, dark view of humanity and life, and Black's patience is working overtime as he tries to show White another way to look at the world. Black is a Christian, and the Bible does get talked about to the point where they debate some of the stories. Black has a Christian perspective and is trying to save White, but the faith talk is not super excessive if you're worried about that. I know that could be overkill sometimes. Their discussion was engaging and thought provoking. You learn a lot about their lives and experiences that have shaped their views. The discussion evolves quickly and it makes you feel a lot of emotions. It gets deep and you wrestle with some complex thoughts and emotions. Throughout the play, Black is committed to changing White's perspective on life. You can tell he is a man of faith, and despite White's stubbornness, Black continues to practice patience with wanting to understand White's point of view while trying to offer counterpoints to prevent White from moving forward with ending his life. I think the biggest takeaway I took from this play was you're not always going to succeed despite your best intentions. I apologize if this is a spoiler, but by the end of the book, you get the sense that Black has failed because White's mindset seems unchanged and he tends to want to move forward with ending his life. Black breaks down over this and sees himself as a failure. However, Black gives it his all, and I do not consider that a failure because sometimes you really just can't change people, especially someone like White who is really stubborn. It does not always work out the way we intend to. The same thinking can be applied to most things in life. We can put in all this effort and work, whether it's for an exam, job interview, sports, etc. But sometimes it doesn't work as it should. We don't get the job. We don't win the game. However, we can try to keep our heads up knowing we gave it our all, and maybe next time the outcome will be different. I think that's the main thing I take away from this book. Overall, a great play slash book that I highly recommend, and I think you'll reflect a lot on. Go ahead and give it a try. I wanted to finish the month off with one of my favorite crime writers, John Patrick Manchette. My first time reading John Patrick was back in January when I read The Mad and the Bad. That book was a fast paced, chaotic, action packed book, which I really enjoyed, and you could see that review on my January book recap video. That experience made me really want to read more of his work, which led me to this book, Nada. Nada takes place in France during the early 1970s, and you follow this militant anarchist group, or the Nada group, and they devise a plan to kidnap the American ambassador. What can go wrong? Well, turns out a lot can. The Nada group has a wide variety of characters. You have a terminal alcoholic, Spanish Civil War orphan, a high school philosophy teacher with a bad temper, a veteran of the French Resistance, and a woman with a house on the country, just to name a few. All of them bring something unique to the story with their dialogue and actions. There's also this unhinged police commissioner who is assigned to the case to find and rescue the American ambassador. This guy plays by his own rules and is not afraid to resort to violence and torture to get what he wants. He's the definition of a crooked cop. I'm not an expert in European history, but there was a lot of political unrest during this time period from the research that I've done, and this book does a good job at highlighting the tension that existed during that time in the continent. When it comes to reading this book, action is the main driving point. It is a classic, fast paced thriller crime novel. It is really chaotic at times, too. The Nada group seems in over their heads at times, and seeing things spiral out of control with the plot was just really super entertaining to watch. Overall, I really enjoyed this story. It keeps you engaged, and basically all the characters are unhinged, which provides a layer of humor to the already absurd plan of trying to kidnap the American ambassador for ransom money. This book is also really short, so you can finish it in about 2 or 3 days. Overall, a great novel. If you like crime novels or just anything with some fast paced action, go ahead and give this a try. You're not going to be disappointed. Well, this concludes my May 2026 book recap. Again, a solid reading month for me, from reading a great biography of one of the most influential men of all time, to discovering another fine piece of work from one of my favorite authors, Cormac McCarthy, to finally reading the infamous Lonesome Dove, where I feel like I just transformed as a reader. Looking ahead to June, I've decided to embark on another epic literary journey to kick off the month of June. I have decided to read, wait for it, The Count of Monte Cristo. with the challenge of trying to finish it before my birthday, which falls on the 24th. It will be a challenge as this book is almost 1,200 pages. As you can see, this thing is quite a brick. But I've been wanting to read The Count of Monte Cristo for a while. I have heard it's one of those books where the hype is 100% justified, and I was thinking of what better way to close the chapter of age 31 with finishing one of the greatest books of all time. I'm not sure if this is too ambitious for the month of June, but after reading Lonesome Dove, I'm also aiming to read and finish The Streets of Laredo. This is the last book chronologically in Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove series, and after The Streets of Laredo, I will have finished the entire series, which I am so excited for because this has just been a life-altering series as a reader, and I am so excited to close it with The Streets of Laredo. Well, again, this concludes my video for you today. Again, thank you so much for all your support. I know there are so many options out there for book content, but taking the time out of your day to view one of my videos or shorts just means the world to me. Feel free to continue to like, subscribe, or comment on the books I have shared, or books you want to recommend to me. I always like those conversations. I always could talk books. Until next time, stay safe and happy reading.